the other one on the Institute of Public Policy Commission on National Security, and the last one on National Equality, what was it? Panel, that's right, yes. Today's talk is on multiculturalism and interculturalism, in particular how it's played out in Europe.
Yeah.
So please join me in welcoming Professor Tariq Modood to Beacon and to Melbourne. Thank you very much. So we've got about 45 minutes, and then we'll have discussion and questions.
Well, thank you, Vince, for that introduction, and thank you all, and thank you for the invitation to have this opportunity to address you. As you can see from this slide, and as I expect some of you are probably aware, the Journal of Intercultural Studies, the home of which is here, just in its April issue, had an article by Nasamir and myself, which then Vince and others decided it would be good to use to have a debate on the nature of interculturalism and its relationship to multiculturalism. And you'll see from the bottom of the slide some very distinguished commentators, discussants of our piece, people like Will Kimlicka and Jeff Levy, Nina Rovner, and Michel Vivorka, in fact, to name them all. Can I come in? Sorry. I brought some Melbourne people with me.
Yeah.
But they're late, as you can see.
Was it time?
Is that right? And the talk I want to give to you is actually very much based on that article. I mean, if some of you have had a chance to look at the article, that's good. From my point of view, that's good, because you already have some familiarity with it. But if you haven't, if you don't know it, that's good as well, because I'd like to have a debate with you, a discussion with you about it, especially as the Journal of Intercultural Studies belongs to the research centre here. Quite like to see what is the thinking of people who see themselves as working in intercultural studies. Now, I said to Vince that the subtitle of this talk could be a European debate, but I've taken that off my slide. I mean, partly because it's a little bit misleading, because look, the journal is based here, and this is where the debate's taking place in print. You'll see from the discussants, I mean, Will Kimlicka is Canadian, and Jeff Levy is a political philosopher in Sydney. So it's a little bit misleading to say it's a European debate, but it is a debate that we're having in Europe. More in politics, I would say, than in academia itself. Though obviously academics and public intellectuals do get involved. And this debate is really part of something larger, and that is dissatisfaction with multiculturalism, both within academia and within politics as a whole. In fact, dissatisfaction is putting it very mildly. There's been certainly in politics a very fierce, almost sometimes hysterical reaction against multiculturalism. And you know, people describe it as a backlash, and the kind of rhetoric used against multiculturalism is things like that it's failed, that it's dead, good riddance, and so on. I won't go into any of that. Probably I expect most of you are aware of it, because it is part of the global current affairs, and of course it's not confined just to Western Europe. Though it's good to see that you have a government here that is making a commitment to, or a reaffirmation of multiculturalism, at least at some level or other, and maybe that too would be interesting to discuss later. So I'm not going to go into the backlash, but that is an important backdrop to the discussion I want to carry out and put before you. The specific questions I'm interested in are, firstly, the relationship between the political critique of multiculturalism and interculturalism. And secondly, whether and in what sense is interculturalism an advance on multiculturalism. One of the key documents, certainly in politics, in relation to interculturalism is this white paper produced by the Council of Europe. Now, the Council of Europe is, in some sense, a very kind of big and grand organization. I mean, it's much bigger in terms of its membership, much bigger than the European Union. I mean, the Council of Europe has 47 member states. And they produced this white paper based on consultations with NGOs across Europe, across some or all of those 47 countries. And they found that there was a lot of loss of support for multiculturalism amongst these NGOs, and these were, if you like, relevant NGOs. Some of whom presumably had been, I haven't seen the list of who these NGOs are, but some of whom presumably had been advocates of multiculturalism in one form or another. And the main conclusion, therefore, of this white paper is to offer or to join in the critique of multiculturalism while acknowledging the fact of diversity. And therefore, if you take that together, critique of multiculturalism, but the fact of diversity, they then say, we need something like intercultural dialogue or interculturalism. Let me take a key quote from that white paper, which came out in 2008, I believe. So it's quite a long quote. While you're reading out, I'll read it out as well. So, whilst driven by benign intentions, multiculturalism is now seen by many as having fostered communal segregation and mutual incomprehension. And this is, based on what these NGOs are saying to the Council of Europe researchers, as well as having contributed to the undermining of the rights of individuals, and in particular women, within minority communities, perceived as if these were single collective actors, that's to say minority communities, perceived as if these were single collective actors. The cultural diversity of contemporary societies has to be acknowledged as an empirical fact. However, a recurrent theme of the consultation was that multiculturalism was a policy with which respondents no longer felt at ease. So that's quite a damning critique, but by no means original. I mean, the first half of that quote is standard critique of multiculturalism by its critics. But here you have this authoritative document from the Council of Europe based on consultations with key actors, NGOs and other key policy field actors in the field of diversity, migration, equality, and so on. And then they go on to advocate some kind of interculturalism. And this is not by any means confined to Europe. Here is a report from UNESCO on cultural diversity and intercultural dialogue. I won't go into it, just to let you know that UNESCO too has endorsed the idea that interculturalism is, if you like, the new multiculturalism. Goodbye multiculturalism, welcome interculturalism. And here, this is the European Commission, which nominated the year 2008 as the European Year of Intercultural Dialogue. So you've got this, top-down commitment to something called interculturalism or intercultural dialogue, part of the premise of which is that multiculturalism has had its day and has created a number of problems, which I listed in that quote, and that this is the view not of, as it were, conservative politicians or opinion polls, populist backlash. This is the opinion of people who are working in the field, who are, as it were, at the cutting edge of migration, multiculturalism, and so on. So in our article, we ask, is interculturalism an updated version, to use an expression someone's used, of multiculturalism? If so, what is being updated? If not, in what ways, if at all, is interculturalism different, substantively or otherwise, from multiculturalism? Now, note that interculturalism shares a standard feature of the critiques of multiculturalism. So this isn't by any means part of the doctrine of interculturalism only. It's shared much more widely. And that is that this critique of multiculturalism lacks textual reference to what one might call pro-multiculturalist views. That is to say, the views of people who call themselves multiculturalists, like myself. So I don't mind people saying, oh, multiculturalism's all wrong, or it's partly wrong, or having whatever views that they do. Obviously, we're all entitled to that, and that's how we talk and learn from each other. But I'm not exactly happy when people tell me multiculturalism is the source of all kinds of confusion and problems, as the European Council and others are telling me, when they don't actually cite any multiculturalists and say, well, this is what you said, but that's not right. Or this is what you advocated, but look at the consequences. And so they allow the whole kind of movement of multiculturalism, including its academic supporters, allow multiculturalism to be defined by its critics. And I hope you'll forgive me, share with me, that this isn't an adequate way of defining a movement or a set of ideas. I mean, we wouldn't define feminism by asking, well, what do the critics of feminists say? And whatever they say is what feminism is. Or socialism. We wouldn't say, oh, if you want to find out what socialism is, don't read socialists. Let's find out what the neoliberals have got to say about socialism. Then we'll have a working definition of socialism. But this is, not just interculturalist. This is the standard way in which multiculturalism is now discoursed in Western Europe and I think elsewhere as well. That it's all constructed by critics. So we identify in this article 4 ways that interculturalism is alleged to contrast positively against multiculturalism in context of cultural diversity. Firstly, that interculturalism stands for a certain kind of convivial openness to other people, and is therefore more geared towards interaction and dialogue than multiculturalism has been. That's one claim. Second claim is that interculturalism is less based on thinking about groups, crude thinking about groups and how groups should be represented in politics and so on, and therefore it's more yielding of synthesis, of overlaps and of developing common positions, of common bases of action than multiculturalism is, because multiculturalism tends to identify a series of separate groups. The third claim is that interculturalism is committed to a stronger sense of the trans-group whole. Now that's just my own expression I've just made up, trans-group whole. But again, I hope it makes some sense and is consistent with the first 2 points, that interculturalism is about going beyond your group. Say if your group is Chinese or Pakistanis or Muslims or something. It's about not just speaking to and coming to some kind of politics that is group-based, your personal group-based, but it's about reaching beyond your group to share something in common with others, including people who may be members of other groups. So that's what I mean by the trans-group whole, the whole being the whole we all belong to. Though I've put it here in brackets, note that interculturalists are divided on what their view of the whole is. Some think that the whole is something local, like a neighbourhood, or the city, Melbourne or London. Some think the whole is our country, something national, like Britain or Australia. And some think the whole is actually the globe, humanity and so on, some kind of cosmopolitanism. As the talk develops, you'll see that's quite an important division within interculturalism. And it's quite and Europe has a different view on this than another view, which I'll put before you. So then finally, the fourth criticism of interculturalism and therefore positive advocacy for interculturalism is that multiculturalism has been too tolerant of minority practices, because by and large it tends to just say right on to minority practices. It just tends to celebrate them. It says, yes, do your own thing, great. Cannibalism, fine. We respect your traditions, of course. Don't ask us to to share your meals, but yes, we'll wave a flag for you. Interculturalism doesn't say right on. It engages through conversation, dialogue, and where necessary, criticism of illiberal cultural practices. Just one point before I leave this slide, returning to point 3, is that you're probably aware, though this partly depends on your kind of disciplinary background, because I think disciplines vary. I mean, political theory, where probably I would say multiculturalism to this day enjoys the most positive kind of support, not by any means universal, but more positive than in other disciplines. It's very noticeable that, of course, political theory is by and large focused on the state, typically the national state. And so multiculturalism, as it's been developed by political theorists, people like Will Kimlicka and Charles Taylor and so on, tends to be about the nation or the national state. It tends to be about the state. And Quebec interculturalism is also focused on the state. Quebec interculturalism being based upon a critique of Canadian federal multiculturalism. I'll have more to say about that. But in Europe, interculturalism is actually more focused on the local and global, and sometimes the two together in the expression some people have coined the glocal. And that kind of pincer movement tends to be at the expense of the national. And it's perceived in Europe that multiculturalism is too focused on the nation state. And in particular, in terms of kind of academic affinities and academic support, I would say social theory, sociology, cultural studies, and geography are good examples of where probably the majority consensus of the people who study these topics and debate these topics tends to be against the nation state. Whereas in political theory, as I say, it's assumed that multiculturalism is a political idea which targets the nation state. It's about how a nation state ought to be under conditions of diversity and equality. So let's explore these four views a bit more, and in particular, of course, what Nassimir and I have to say about them. So that's the first one. Now, they say that multiculturalism is not sufficiently dialogical. Okay, that's their view. But given what I said about the perverse way in some people define multiculturalism, instead of looking at what multiculturalists say, they look at what the critics say. Why don't we begin with classic statements of multiculturalism, or landmark texts of multiculturalism. Here's one, Charles Taylor's Politics of Recognition. I think everybody will agree that this is a foundational statement of multiculturalism, being highly influential. Well, I'm sure you know it, so let me remind you that one of its central ideas is that identity is dialogically formed, and that people in power, people in dominant positions, have the power to injure the identities of subordinate groups, and therefore they misrecognize the identities of the weak, minorities, and so on, and that this constitutes a harm. And therefore Charles Taylor argues that an appropriate dialogical relationship is that of recognition based on respect rather than power relations. So, well, here's a fundamental doctrine of multiculturalism. It's about dialogue. Here's another one. Bhikkhu Parekh's Rethinking Multiculturalism, I think one of the best statements and discussions of multiculturalism in the world. His book of the year 2000. And one of the core theoretical arguments of the book is that cultural diversity has an intrinsic value because it challenges people to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of their own cultures and ways of life. And so intercultural dialogue, and that's his term, he has a whole chapter called Intercultural Dialogue, and so intercultural dialogue is an appropriate response to diversity and facilitates self-knowledge and freedom from, as it were, being trapped in your own culture, only thinking within your own culture or thinking your culture is always right. My culture right or wrong. Well, that's really one of the classic statements of multiculturalism. So it's not really very persuasive to say that interculturalism is committed to dialogue and multiculturalism is not. Okay, you might say, well, that's just philosophy, but can we get a bit closer to the ground? Well, actually, even politically, in contrast to, say, liberal nationalist or human rights or class-based approaches, multiculturalism emphasizes the giving of voice in the public square to marginalized groups, and so of achieving non-assimilative egalitarian integration through dialogue and negotiation. That's what we normally think about when we think about multiculturalism. Now, what is true is that multiculturalists assume there's a sense in which the participants to a dialogue are groups or cultures. And this leads to the second point of alleged contrast. So I'm not very impressed by that first contrast, but let's look at the second one. And this is the view that interculturalism is less groupist. Here's a quote from some authors who believe this. They say multiculturalism tends to preserve a cultural heritage, while interculturalism acknowledges and enables cultures to have currency, to be exchanged, to circulate, to be modified and evolve. Okay, what do Nasser and I think about that? Well, we think you need to distinguish between two different politics of interculturalism, which I've already started doing, but let's explore that further. So this is the first position, and this is the position that's stronger in Europe. That discourses of interculturalism are relatively apolitical. They're usually about local encounters, or perhaps city-level policies, possibly, though I'm not sure exactly what the policies might be, but they're usually about contact, exchange, conviviality, and what's sometimes referred to as everyday multiculturalism. And one of the theoretical ideas driving that is a kind of anti-essentialism, deconstructing the idea that cultures are unified or monistic, that a group has a certain coherent reality. Well, okay, I mean, I'm an anti-essentialist of a sort myself, but the question is, well, what politics follows from that kind of critique, from anti-essentialism? And in the discourses I'm referring to, which I said to you a few minutes ago, I thought were in many ways the dominant positions within social theory, sociology, cultural studies, and cultural geography, no constructive politics seems to follow. So it leaves an empty space where there should be national discourse, policies, and debate. You could say, and I would say, you know, myself, I'd agree with that, that there is a kind of implicit philosophy behind these studies and behind this kind of orientation, which we could describe as a philosophy of freedom or emancipation from discrete monistic group identities in favor of individual self-expression and hybridity. You know, okay, I kind of recognize that ethos. And again, I think I'd like to share it, do share it. But in relation to these particular advocates of these approaches, especially when they are entitled interculturalism, this ethos, welcome as it is, you know, very attractive ethos, is rarely translated into national policies and laws. So what about the other version, the other politics of interculturalism, the second one? Now, again, I referred to this because I think to find an explicit political interculturalism, we actually need to turn to Quebec, because there isn't really one in Europe. To authors such as Alain Gagnon, Gérard Bouchard, and Vince was just telling me that Charles Taylor has just published something on interculturalism and multiculturalism in the current or very recent issue of Philosophy and Social Criticism. So, and of course, he's a Quebecer. So there seems to be a political interculturalism in Quebec in the way that there isn't in Europe. And two of its kind of principal components are that Quebec, and not merely federal Canada, is a public space and an object to which immigrants need to identify and integrate into. And secondly, interculturalism means that we should seek to maintain Quebec as a nation and not just a federal province. I think that actually this can be accommodated within multiculturalism, and of course is given pride of place in Will Kimlicker's liberal multiculturalism. And if we wanted to extrapolate it to Europe, we could say yes, Scotland, Catalonia, Flanders, that they should be recognized as nations and not treated as, say, ethnic groups, which actually they're not. Nobody thinks Scotland is a ethnic, whatever, entity. When we list ethnic groups, ethnic minorities in the UK, Scottish is not one of them. So we're not actually being told anything desperately new in that relation. But of course, in Europe, we think issues of multinationalism and issues of multi-ethnicity are quite distinct sets of issues. And maybe the argument is that we shouldn't have them as distinct as they are. But in any case, this is not what is meant by interculturalism in Europe and by, say, the European Council that I began with. So let's turn to the third argument, the third claim. The claim that interculturalism has a stronger sense of the whole, whilst multiculturalism separates and fragments. Well, our response to that is that multiculturalism is precisely concerned with remaking unity in terms of citizenship and national identity. That actually it's not so distant from that Quebec interculturalism, and it's certainly committed to some vision of the whole. But a core idea of multiculturalism is that all prescribed unity, by prescribed unity we mean, you know, some kind of top-down idea of what unity is, like what it is to be British, say, what it is to be Australian, that all prescribed unity retains a majoritarian bias that places the burden of adaptation upon the minority, and so is inconsistent with interculturalism's commitment to mutual integration. So the point I'm making there is that actually interculturalism too uncritically accepts what this whole is. One of the things that multiculturalism is committed to is about remaking the whole, whereas interculturalism, by focusing just on encounters, exchanges, the everyday, denudes what this backdrop might be, and therefore is not really critically engaging with it, and is therefore not remaking it. If we think about the Commission on Multi-Ethnic Britain that Vince referred to in the introduction, we produced the report, The Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain, and I've put future in italics as an example, because here's a kind of, you know, a multiculturalist policy document, probably, in my view, the most important public document on multiculturalism in Britain. And I emphasize the word there, future. So it's talking not so much about how Britain is just now, but also how it can be. But it's about this whole called Britain, and about changing it, engaging with it, moving it forwards in the direction we think it should be going. It's about the remaking of Britishness. So what is the unity that interculturalists are offering? If they're not interested in the future of multi-ethnic Britain, if that's a kind of a bad multiculturalist idea, what is the future that they're offering? Well, they use terms like post-national and global, but it's not at all clear to me how this is a strong sense of the whole at all. It seems a very weak sense of the whole. So I'm not very impressed by this argument that interculturalism has a stronger commitment to the whole. Lastly, remember the last argument claim was about that interculturalism was not so tolerant of illiberal practices, because the view is that multiculturalism lends itself to illiberality and to cultural relativism, moral relativism, whereas interculturalism engages with cultures in a positive way, but where necessary, criticizes and censures culture. Well, I think actually this idea, we have to note, this idea is really pretty central in the backlash against multiculturalism, and it's very much targeted upon Muslims in Europe and probably elsewhere as well, including, I think, in Australia. Because Muslim claims have been characterized by many people, by critics, as ambitious, meaning Muslims are asking for too much. You know, they want school uniforms changed, they want to wear different clothes, they want something called Sharia. This is all just too much. Why are Muslims demanding all these things? And that they're difficult to accommodate. And that they may be inconsistent with individual rights and secularism. And in this backlash, Muslim practices such as veiling are conflated with alleged Muslim practices, such as forced marriages, female genital mutilation, a rejection of positive law in favor of criminal Sharia law, and so on. And the whole approach creates a radical otherness about Muslims, far from kind of drawing them into some kind of intercultural relationship, it creates an otherness about Muslims, while arguing that there's a liberality about the multiculturalism that is accommodative of Muslims, because to accommodate Muslims is to license a whole series of ambitious demands on the part of Muslims which will erode individual rights and secularism. Now, these are popular criticisms. You know, these are criticisms you find in the newspapers every day of the week. And they actually are across the political spectrum. You couldn't just say these are right-wing views or whatever. They are right-wing views, but they're also to be found in the centre, the left, and so on. But they do seem to be part of the advocacy of interculturalism. And in this, they seem to be endorsing prejudice rather than challenging it. This prejudice, in particular, is focused on Muslims, as I've already elaborated, but also actually on religion, which is negatively contrasted with culture. I suggest that there's a knee-jerk reaction that condemns religious identities rather than examines them and their claims and practices and so on a case-by-case basis. So yes, there can be critical response to things that minorities do, to things that minorities want exemptions from, and so on. But we shouldn't just say, oh, well, it's religious and therefore too ambitious. Let's look at it on a case-by-case basis. Moreover, culture can actually be the problem sometimes. Culture can be the problem and religion the solution. We shouldn't put religious identities in the dock while saying, oh, we're very keen on celebrating cultural diversity, as if somehow culture has this kind of positive, be good, feel good character, and religion is authoritarian and reactionary. Because actually, take something like clitoridectomy, it has little support from any religion in the parts of the world that it's practiced, mainly in Central and East Africa. It is practiced by some Muslims, by some Christians, and by some paganists. But certainly as far as Christianity and Islam are concerned, it's not supported, neither by text nor by what we might call religious leaders, you know, priests and imams and sheikhs and so on. And religious condemnation is more effective in challenging these cultural mores because the people who practice it recognize the legitimacy of these religions and so are more likely to attend to criticism which is based upon these religious traditions rather than on being told that what they do is illiberal. And therefore it's better to acknowledge that the multi in multiculturalism will encompass different kinds of groups and does not itself privilege any one kind or, you know, disprivilege other kinds, because I'm arguing that this approach, both within interculturalism and more widely, disprivileges religious identities. I'm arguing that recognition should be given to the identities that marginalized groups themselves value and find strength in. Whether these be racial, religious, or ethnic, we should be even-handed between religious identities and other kinds of cultural identities. Groups shouldn't, for example, be told to not prioritize religious identities, to privatize religious identities, and to instead project racial or ethnic or gender or sexuality, sexualized identities, which of course have, you know, come to be important public identities, especially non-heterosexual sexual identities, which previously were thought to be should be closeted. Now we say they share the public space, which may be dominated by heterosexuals, but is not exclusive to heterosexuals. Well, I'm saying exactly we should do the same with religious identities. Now here, I accept some degree of criticism. The kind of position I hold myself, which I'll refer to as multiculturalism, may be too open-ended by being dialogical, not by being undialogical actually, but by being dialogical rather than prescriptive, by advocating change through empowering what is sometimes referred to as minorities within minorities, such as, say, women and young people in more traditional communities, and these can be, say, Pakistani Muslims in Britain. But people like me, we've argued that if there are practices that demean categories of people within conservative, orthodox communities, traditional communities, let us empower those who are being demeaned, those who are being marginalized, such as, say, women or young people, and in some cases, like, say, in Hinduism and so on, lower castes. Let's empower people within the communities rather than bring the power of the state, which on the one hand will bring criminal law, and on the other hand, certain kinds of agencies associated with social work, perhaps, and of course schooling, teachers and social work. But above all, of course, the one that's most coercive is the power of criminal law. Now, I realize this is a difficult position. I couldn't 100% say that the view I've just put forward, which is indeed my view, is always right. I think sometimes legal intervention in minority practices probably is necessary. So I wouldn't make an absolute rule here. But the point I'm raising is that interculturalism offers no advance on that. They haven't got an alternative view unless their alternative is simply that the liberal state should take over. Just a few days before I left Britain, I mean this meaning last week, the end of last week in fact, the British government announced that they are going to bring legislation to Parliament to criminalise forced marriage. Well, it's not obvious that that is the right way to, I mean, if we all agree that forced marriage is unacceptable, it's not the right way of doing things, people shouldn't be forced against their will to have spouses. But it's not clear that it'll work by having criminal law. It will alienate the communities whose support you need, i.e. because the practices are to be found in those communities. Some of these practices will go underground. There'll be community solidarity against what's seen as the dominant white liberal state telling minorities how to conduct their affairs, and it be part of the kind of inferiorizing of minorities and their cultures. So multiculturalists in Britain are divided on this. Some think that legislation is necessary, some think that a policy of empowerment which doesn't bring the law in is the better approach. Let's say to empower young women through groups and negotiations and advocacy and campaigns and persuasion within the community rather than the law. And I'm not, as I've already stated, I have some ambivalence about this, and I certainly think the law is necessary sometimes. But the point, all I'm making here in relation to interculturalism, just to say, well, let's talk. Well, of course, multiculturalists say that, and that actually doesn't always solve the problem. So it's not clear how interculturalism offers any advance. So very briefly, these are the conclusions in the article that this talk's based on. While advocates of interculturalism wish to emphasize its 4 positive qualities, each of these already feature and are on occasion foundational to multiculturalism too. So actually they haven't identified anything new or different. Multiculturalism presently surpasses interculturalism as a political orientation that is able to recognize that social life consists of individuals and groups, and that both need to be provided for in the formal and informal distribution of powers, as well as reflected in an ethical conception of citizenship, and not just an instrumental conception of citizenship. Finally, interculturalism does not, intellectually at least, eclipse multiculturalism. I don't, as you can see, I don't find any strong intellectual arguments. It may highlight aspects of, or be supplemental to multiculturalism, or correct certain excesses, omissions. But these are all intra. What I mean by intra is actually they're all part of what multiculturalists themselves are arguing about and always have argued about. They're all positions within, emphases within multiculturalism. They're not external critiques. And therefore, interculturalism is not a substitute, but a or several versions of multiculturalism. So interculturalism should be seen as a version of multiculturalism, not its substitution, not its replacement. Now that's what our own article was, but as I said to you, there was a debate that followed, and I'd just like to conclude by referring to and responding to one particular set of criticism that we were offered. Though to be quite honest, I don't know what Vince, as an editor of the journal, thinks, but I think actually our discussants weren't very critical. They were by and large supportive. None of them, we had the 4 discussants we had, none of them supported interculturalism anyway. But anyway, here's one criticism we were presented with. Namely, that we were too intellectualist in the argument that I've presented so far. And this criticism came from Will Kimlicka, obviously prominent multiculturalist, without doubt. And his argument was that intellectuals in Europe, but not Canada, this is his own argument, intellectuals in Europe should consider abandoning the term multiculturalism to promote their policies and join the interculturalist bandwagon. Now, you might think I'm caricaturing his view here, bandwagon and so on. I'm not. He refers to interculturalism as a fad. So he's completely scathing about it. He says it's intellectually shoddy, but he says, hey, guys, meaning you in Europe, people like myself in Europe, you've lost the political battle. You can't revive the term multiculturalism. It's just too politically damaged. So these interculturalists, according to your own critique, are actually a version of multiculturalism anyway. So why don't you go along with it? Smuggle your multiculturalism under their wrapping and say, yeah, interculturalism, right on, and these are the policies. So that's what he says we should be doing. Well, what do I think about that? Well, Will, actually, Quebec interculturalism is more coherent and more deeply rejectionist of multiculturalism than anything found in Europe. So he should seek his own advice, act on his own advice, because that's what the Quebecers are saying to Will Kimlicka and to the Canadian federal architecture of multiculturalism. They're saying, no, multiculturalism isn't right for us, we want interculturalism. So I'd be more impressed if he was not exceptionalizing Canada in his advice. Secondly, Will Kimlicka is quite mistaken in thinking that European politicians support interculturalism and therefore people like me in order to be practical realists, political realists. And I would call myself a kind of realist and pragmatist, so I wouldn't kind of hold out for interculturalism on a purely intellectual ground if I thought that I could make some practical advance by doing something different. But actually, these European politicians, they don't support interculturalism, despite those documents that I pointed to. You may be aware that only a year ago, we had some very high-profile speeches from the leading premiers of Western Europe. Within a space of about 6 weeks, Nicolas Sarkozy, Chancellor Merkel, and Prime Minister Cameron all condemned multiculturalism in the strongest terms and with the greatest degree of publicity. And did they say, oh, multiculturalism's had its day, we're now all in favor of interculturalism? Did they help? They said, multiculturalism is all wrong and so on, and we need more successful policies of integration, and they never ever use the term interculturalism, let alone support it. And I did a Google search using the term interculturalism when we were writing our response to Will Kimlicka a few months ago. And I went through the first 100 Google responses after that I gave up. But I went through the first 100 responses. And not one of the 100 was either a political reference, i.e. a reference to a government document or a political speech by a senior politician, whether in government or in opposition, and none of them were to any major British paper. I'm just talking about references in the English language. You know, if something can be found in Czech or Catalan, okay, maybe, I don't know. But the first 100 Google references failed to identify a single governmental or large newspaper reference, a national newspaper reference, daily newspaper reference. So don't go away thinking Europe is hotly debating interculturalism. They are not. It's just these bureaucrats at the European Commission and the European Council and so on that think that interculturalism is a great idea. And and maybe they have a political strategy, which is exactly the strategy that Will is referring to. They think, we support diversity, the politicians will never buy into multiculturalism anymore, it's had such a terrible press, let us repackage our support for diversity by calling it interculturalism. That may be their strategy, but the politicians haven't bought it. The politicians prefer to talk about integration and national identity. And my own view is that, given that I'm a realist, and given the above argument about how to achieve political influence that Will's made, and which I share in principle, though not his interpretation of it, I think that we should actually engage with these concepts, not with interculturalism, but with integration and national identity. And we should engage with them in order to multiculturalize them. And let me conclude by just referring to two places where this is exactly what I've been doing. So this is a booklet that I published with the British Academy in February called Post-Immigration Difference and Integration, where I talk about multiculturalism as a mode of integration. In fact, I distinguish between two forms of multiculturalist modes of integration. And if you go to the British Academy website, you can have that, it can be downloaded for free. And finally, looking beyond, even the other paper was beyond Britain, but here, in this book, European Multiculturalisms, which is the results of a 3-year European project across 9 countries, funded by the European Commission. Again, we try and describe what we think multiculturalism or multiculturalisms can amount to or is amounting to in Europe by looking at issues around integration and national identity rather than interculturalism. So I think that really is the way forward, and I'm, as you can see, not persuaded that interculturalism is the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq. Great. All right, let's open to the floor. Questions and comments? Alex, you're eager to ask them.
I'm currently working on an intellectual history of Australian multiculturalism, so I really see your point very strongly that we need to start looking at the individual figures and who are the people speaking about what. And it strikes me that a lot of the problems and the issues that you're talking about, they're really fundamental problems to liberalism and democracy generally. So I think the more we understand these problems of liberalism and democracy and the way they've manifested themselves in various speakers and various traditions, I think it might be a way to sort of really help to get on top of these problems and these issues. So yeah, that's basically just.
Yeah, well, I would agree. I would agree with that. I think that multiculturalism. I mean, multiculturalism can take more than one form. But the multiculturalism that I've been talking about all this morning, and in fact, that I write about, I think is best understood as a kind of development within liberal egalitarianism. So it is a way of liberal egalitarianism coping with certain kinds of difference and of going beyond merely a kind of individualist orientation by recognizing, for instance, groups and the importance of group identities to the lives of individuals who may otherwise be marginalized or have second-class citizenship. So I don't describe myself as a liberal multiculturalist like Will Kimlicka, because I'm not, because I think we have to go beyond liberalism in certain ways, just as social democracy goes beyond liberalism in certain ways. But nevertheless, I don't want to, by going beyond liberalism, I don't mean reject liberalism, reject certain limits and constraints. So where liberals draw boundaries, I think sometimes are in the wrong place. Just as there's some liberals on strict liberal doctrines, you couldn't justify certain aspects of the welfare state or of Keynesian economic policy. So I think exactly the same with multiculturalism. It is nested within liberal egalitarian ideas. It's an engagement with liberal egalitarian ideas, democratic ideas, but it's a particular set of ideas and doctrines and attempts to innovate and to make liberalism relevant to new kinds of contexts, to our contexts of what I referred to as post-immigration difference. So I agree with that, and I'm actually a big critic of a lot of writing in our field, which is non-political theory oriented, which makes no reference to it. Not that I think everyone should do political theory and not say sociology or cultural studies. Obviously, that would be quite ridiculous. But I think that what we have, and interculturalism, I think, is an example of that, is people who argue that they are doing something for analytical reasons, but actually are very strongly normatively driven, but they refuse to state their normative position, and therefore you can't criticize their normative position because it's too elusive, and they don't engage, therefore, with other people's normative positions. So just to give you an example that I think is quite close to kind of interculturalism, all this emphasis on everyday multiculturalism, quite a fashionable term, certainly in my neck of the woods. Well, everyday multiculturalism, they say, look at how people actually live. What difference does certain things in their lives make? What's its significance? What difference does certain policies that might be called multiculturalism make, and so on? And of course, if you have a microscope, if you're focused on the everyday, on the micro, you miss out the bigger picture. And one of the conclusions that they often come up with is, actually, multiculturalism doesn't make a lot of difference to people's everyday lives. Well, no, because you're looking at too little. Step back a little bit and see the bigger picture, because multiculturalism is about the bigger picture. And similarly, geographers who have had a very powerful influence, disciplinary influence in the development of the social science study of diversity, they are increasingly saying, they want to focus on the local or on the transnational. And there are very good analytical reasons to do so. And they present some of those analytical reasons. The importance of scale, because something that looks like one kind of thing at a national level can look very different locally, just as Melbourne is very different from Sydney. So if we just talked about Australian multiculturalism, we would lose a lot of the important subtlety and nuance that is actually part of what we should try and understand. So I agree with that, and I also agree with the importance of the transnational. But actually, they also have a normative agenda which they don't state. Having stated the analytical one, fine. but the normative agenda is often very anti-national. So firstly, you can't engage with their normative agenda because they don't state it. Secondly, and this is the point I made in my talk, they leave a hole. By a hole, I mean H-O-L-E, not W-H-O-L-E. They leave a gap where we should have alternative policies. If they don't like multiculturalism, what are their alternative policies? Well, they say, no, we're not interested in the national, let's just focus on the local. So I agree with you that multiculturalism has to be seen in terms of engagement with ideas of liberal democracy.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm very sorry that we came in a little bit late. I think Victoria is a really interesting case study here. Victoria maintained and has maintained a commitment to multiculturalism at the state level, the political level, the community level, all through this period of attack on multiculturalism, which certainly at the federal level in Australia, there was a demise of the centrality of multiculturalism in the federal policy. So I think that there's two reasons, and I'd just like your views on what you think might be going on here. One, linking to things that you mentioned. So one is that public intellectuals, academics, our voices, those people who have defended multiculturalism, not necessarily just from a normative position, but also through engagement with different research and also publications coming from Europe and Canada. We have been listened to by state actors, definitely. So there have been critiques, but we've also been heard at the state level, not necessarily federally. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I would say that Victorian multiculturalism, even Australian multiculturalism, offers a primacy to the law in a way that European multiculturalism maybe doesn't do. To the law? To the law. So in a lot of the policies that were developed in the 80s and onwards, there are always statements that we respect diversity, we respect practices as long as they are consistent with the overarching law. So I think Petro Giorgio and others have mentioned that this might be a reason why multiculturalism, in a sense, has continued to work in the context of Victoria. But I have not contrasted it explicitly with European policy. But in terms of things that you were mentioning there about the fourth point, I think maybe there is something of relevance there.
Well, I guess I'm not sure I fully understand the point you're making about law, because the rule of law is pretty important in Britain and in Canada and in all the other countries. Of course, the British approach to law is different from the French and German approach, famously different. We have an unwritten constitution. We have a powerful system of common law, which has got reduced through the European Union codifications, but nevertheless, the British, traditional approach has been to use law less and to use precedent and the discretion of judicial interpretation more. So, but I don't think that's really a very significant difference in relation to the top things that I've been talking about. If you asked me my view of, and I don't claim to know very much about Australian multiculturalism, but if you just said, from the little that you know, however impressionistic it may be, what do you think are the differences between Australian multiculturalism and ones that you're familiar with in Britain and elsewhere? I would say, and I'm kind of relying on the political theory work of say, Jeff Levy, and some kind of historical and empirical interpretations of people like, for instance, there's an article recently, Anthony Moran was a co-author, I forget the name of the first author. And what they found was that the data showed that people were, even in this time period where perhaps multiculturalism has had a bit of a backlash, certainly globally, that people would say things like, well, diversity is one of the defining features of Australia. that people should be allowed to lead their own lives without having to be told by other people, this is how you have to be, and so on. But at the same time, the same data showed a strong reservation about group-based demands, and about people saying, you know, we are a group, recognize us as a group. So the idea was, well, yes, we all come from different origins and different backgrounds, and we're all, you know, immigrants once, or perhaps not all, because obviously the native Aboriginal peoples and so on. But we're just talking here about what we might call urban multiculturalism. But we should all kind of mix in and become Australians, and what it is to be Australians is a kind of a moving picture as new people come in and become part of that national story. But they should, as it were, be part of that story through their own individual relationships, rather than, this is my group, this is what my group needs, give me a more group-based solution. So, whereas in Britain, on the whole, we do think multiculturalism is about groups, and people who are against forms of group accommodation then tend to be against the term multiculturalism, and that's part of the reasoning behind interculturalism. And I think the same is true in Canada, for instance. So that's, I think the importance of the group is where some of the difference might lie between Australia and, say, Britain.
Australia is very much a secular materialist country. The predominant culture in Australia is the popular culture of commercial television, the workplace, everyday social interaction in the street. I've been to about 3 or 4 conferences on multiculturalism, a couple here, one in the UK, one in the Czech Republic. All of them, I think, left out the commercial culture of popular television. One here actually did refer to the workplace regarding Indian IT people. But the everyday culture, the predominant culture, is arguably far more important than either the political elitists who attack the politically correct, who complain about an old primary school that won't have a nativity play, or the progressive left liberal politically correct people. And also far more than most academic discourses, that there is a reality. The predominant culture of our society we have to address. Now, for good or bad, that is predominantly a commercial culture, it's a work culture, and actually multiculturalism in much of the time is neither here nor there, but frankly, nor is democracy. So I just want to raise those questions. In other words, what I'm saying is that are we all imprisoned by our academic intellectual discourses and not addressing what's actually happening? Yeah. Now, I don't know what's happening, but what I'm saying is that what is happening is possibly more important than the intellectual discourses. Despite sometimes the fact that, as we know, as we can see with Cameron, Merkel, etc., they can have political expression.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's that we are imprisoned because of our intellectual discourses. I wouldn't put it like that. What I'd say is that multiculturalism as a political idea, like most political ideas, is focused on state institutions, on policies, and on laws. So if some processes are happening which escape that nexus, like the popularity of chicken tikka masala. You may be aware that people used to say fish and chips was the national dish. Well, actually, Indian curries and Chinese takeaways way outstrip, in Britain I'm talking about, way outstrip the consumption of fish and chips. And this is before any scares about, cod becoming extinct or anything like that. I mean, it's just a natural process. People follow their taste buds and their wallets, and no politician has said, we're eating too much fish and chips. Let's, welcome our new Indian origin citizens by eating some of their cuisine. Just the opposite. Even, racists enjoy curry. So, if we just were looking at multiculturalism as a political idea, then we wouldn't see what has happened to the change in national eating habits. So you're absolutely right about that. But But I am talking about multiculturalism as a political idea. So the imprisonment isn't due to the discourse, the imprisonment is due to, well, the object of attention. What is it that you are talking about? What is it that you are either critiquing or offering alternatives to, reforms and so on? I mean, take assimilation. I'm opposed to assimilation as a requirement of equal citizenship. And I think, you know, that's pretty much a kind of baseline multiculturalist view. But there are all kinds of ways that people assimilate, which has nothing to do with laws and policies. Me, I mean, look, I'm not wearing a shalwar kameez. I'm wearing what I see everyone else wearing, and which I'm happy to wear. And I don't think, oh, I'm wearing someone else's clothes. I think I'm wearing my own clothes.
You sound very English.
Thank you very much. And
so the compliment, that was a description.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm not against assimilation as long as it's based on individual choice, as long as there isn't coercion, and sometimes where the state needs to play a rebalancing role against certain forms of social coercion, and we may need to support the maintenance of minority cultures who otherwise would be overwhelmed, like for instance having, you know, supplementary schooling in a minority language, or accommodating you know, places of worship within a school or a workplace or whatever. I mean, some of these will be more or less controversial. I'm just giving them as examples. So I wouldn't say I'm trapped by discourse. As a matter of fact, I think that if we looked at sociocultural processes, and we call those multiculturalism, let's say with a small m, Britain is a very multicultural society, especially London.
Does this make multiculturalism a necessary social myth?
I didn't hear.
A necessary social myth.
No.
In the social sense rather than the full sense.
Well, I still think that we will need political accommodation in order to have proper equal citizenship and to have all voices heard and not drowned out by majoritarian processes.
I'm just interested in whether the debate of multiculturalism within Europe and the UK is very separate to the policy of border protection and refugees from Africa and Eastern Europe. Are there two separate policy ideas and framing?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question, because it opens up quite a lot of territory which I didn't go into at all. Well, very briefly, what I would say is that all this rhetorical backlash that we've had against multiculturalism in the last 10 years in Western Europe and elsewhere, the policy consequences have nearly all fallen on immigration control, on, you know, rights of residence, naturalization, and citizenship acquisition. Because that is something that the state could control and change and say, right, we'll change the rules of who we let in. We'll make it more difficult or easier to give people citizenship. And, you know, we've all created, I'm referring to our countries, you know, France, Germany, Britain, so created citizenship tests and raised the standard of proficiency in the national language. So that in the last 10 years, there has been quite strong, definite trend away from what we might call liberal, with a small l, liberal acceptance, to raising the bar as to who we let in, how many people we let in, who can become a citizen, and the importance of the national language. And this is true in so many European countries. Whether they're multiculturalist or anti-multiculturalist, they've all done that. So this, because if you actually look at policies of multiculturalism, apart from Netherlands, which I'd say has seen some reversal, in the other European countries there hasn't been any reversal of policies in relation to existing ethnic minorities. All the change has been in relation to incomers, new incomers, not old incomers, new incomers. So not, if you like, people like me, my parents came to Britain in the 1960s and so on. There's been no policy change that I can recognize that makes my life easier or more difficult or whatever. It's all in relation to news streams. So the rhetoric is about these people aren't integrating. We've had a failure of integration. This is what Merkel, Sarkozy, and Cameron say. But the only levers that they can pull in terms of policy are all to do with new migrants, not ethnic minorities. But the two things aren't completely discrete. In policy terms, they are sometimes discrete. In rhetorical terms, they aren't. But even in policy terms, it very much depends on from country to country. In Britain, people who came, and they primarily came from former Commonwealth countries or current Commonwealth countries, former colonial countries to Britain, say after the war in the 60s and 70s. They became British citizens. Their children were obviously British citizens, and I don't know the exact percentage, and it might be even difficult to even find out what the true figure is. But let's say well over 80%, perhaps 90% or so, have British citizenship. But that is not true in some countries. One country it's not true is Germany. So the biggest non-European origin population in Germany are people from Turkey. But some of them have parents. I mean, some of them born in Germany, have parents born in Germany, and sometimes now even have grandparents who were born in Germany. So they're third generation Turks in Germany, but they don't have German citizenship. Now, there are reasons for that, partly to do with citizenship laws in Germany, partly to do with some issues to do with how Turks feel about Turkey, and the fact that Germans don't allow dual citizenship. They require, within a certain kind of window of adulthood, I'm not sure of the exact figure, let's say it's 18 to 23, you have to say you are a German citizen and only a German citizenship, which may sometimes mean that you have to renounce Turkish nationality, and some haven't done that. So as far as I know, probably only about half of people of Turkish origin in Germany today have German citizenship, whereas something like 90% of people of Pakistani, Indian, and Bangladeshi origin in Britain today have British citizenship. So you can see the big difference that the laws will make, because the Cameron rhetoric, or let's just call it the anti-multiculturalist rhetoric in Britain, doesn't have such a big effect on ethnic minorities in terms of policies and laws. But in Germany, it can have a very major effect, because the changes in citizenship affects second and third generation Turks in the way that changes in citizenship acquisition does not affect second and third generation Pakistanis in Britain.
I have a question. I hope you haven't answered in your talk because I forget. But speaking about Germany, isn't that a good example where the backlash against multiculturalism isn't really against multiculturalism as a political program, because there was no multiculturalism. Yeah. So I think that shows that it is still small and multiculturalism that we need to look at, though, if we try to understand the backlash against multiculturalism.
Well, see, when Chancellor Merkel said multiculturalism utterly failed, it turned out, and of course she said this in German, I've only read the translation, but it turns out that what she had in mind was the Gastarbeiter program, which of course, meaning the guest worker program, and the Federal Republic of Germany and the Turkish state had a formal agreement to have workers come from Turkey to work in Germany for certain periods of time, and the Germans then wanted those people to go back to Turkey, but they still needed labour, so then they wanted some other Turks to come in, to have a kind of rotation, so nobody was in Germany for such a period of time so that they could begin to get settled in Germany. But it didn't work. That was the plan. It didn't work because people did remain settled, and then they started asking their wives and girlfriends, or having marriages, brought those people in, then they started having children. So that policy completely failed. But believe it or not, some people in Germany have called that policy multiculturalism, because one of the things that certain German states did was they had children of Turkish parents be taught the Turkish language, and some of them even offered all schooling in Turkish, because they said, well, you'll need to know Turkish when you go back to Turkey. But they didn't go back. So Chancellor Merkel thought that was, she said, oh, you know, this is multiculturalism, and it's failed. Well, of course, she's absolutely right. That has failed, because it hasn't produced the kind of integration that she wants. And in the same speech, she did say that Muslims had to recognize that this was a Christian country, and that seemed to be quite important to her, and so on. So she does have a very strongly top-down assimilative view of what integration is. Obviously, that's not my idea of what good integration is. So I forget what your question was, but probably agreeing with you, I expect.
We've got time for one more. Yeah.
In your mind, what was the catalyst for these European leaders to announce the death of multiculturalism?
Yeah, because they did this all within a small period of time. In fact, actually, someone did a study and found that I think it was 6 European premiers, not just the 3 I mentioned, 6 European premiers that made almost kind of identical speeches in a period of about 7 months in between the second half of 2010 and early 2011. Well, it may be that there was some kind of concerted thing. I doubt it personally, but I don't know. I mean, they didn't often refer to each other, except that Cameron actually made his speech in Munich. He was at a conference on European security, or even international security, and decided that talking about multiculturalism in Britain was the contribution he was going to make.